Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today we're looking at Chapter 7 of AIG's The New Answers Book 1. This chapter is called Doesn't Carbon-14 Dating Disprove the Bible? And is authored by arch-nemesis of the fuzzy words, Mike Riddle. And, of course, he's only going to be talking about carbon dating, not any of the other radiometric dating methods, a tactic that, whether intentional or unintentional, ends up leaving creationists with the mistaken impression that people who accept evolution believe that carbon dating proves the Earth to be billions of years old, which then causes them to blurt out that carbon dating can only get you to 100,000 years old at most, as though that is some profound point that will cause a worldview shift. So, creationists, if you could stop harping on the carbon dating and focus on some of the other methods as well, that'd be a great way to make your followers look less ignorant. But, I mean, if the people writing creationist materials were actually concerned with making people look less ignorant, they wouldn't be writing creationist materials in the first place, am I right? Let's go!
Chapter 7. Doesn't carbon-14 dating disprove the Bible? Scientists use a technique called radiometric dating to estimate the ages of rocks, fossils, and the Earth. Many people have been led to believe that radiometric dating methods have proved the Earth to be billions of years old.
Yes, one of the many ways that we know the Earth is billions of years old is through radiometric dating of zircon crystals and meteor fragments, usually with uranium series dating.
With our focus on one particular form of radiometric dating, carbon dating, we will see that carbon dating strongly supports a young Earth. Note that, contrary to a popular misconception, carbon dating is not used to date rocks at millions of years old.
See? There it is. Now, when creationists read this article, they will come away with the mistaken impression that evolutionists believe that carbon dating has proved that certain rocks are millions of years old, but they're wrong. I've never actually met anyone who has this misconception about carbon dating. I've only ever seen creationists gleefully declare that carbon dating doesn't prove millions of years, and non-creationists react with an "of course not, that would be silly." I'm sure there are people out there with this misconception. I mean, hell, there are still people who think the Q conspiracy is still going and that the arrests are just around the corner. So you can find people who believe almost anything, but I've never actually seen it myself. The next part is just their summary of how radiometric dating works. Basically, radioactive decay can change how many protons are in an atom's nucleus, which will then change which element that atom is, and this happens at a constant rate, so we can figure out how old a sample is by comparing the amounts of the parent and daughter elements and calculating how long it would have taken for that much of the daughter element to form. There is more to it than that. If you need a more detailed explanation, I do have a standalone video on dating methods that was part of my Evidence for Evolution series, so I'll leave a link to that video for you.
There are two main applications for radiometric dating. One is for potentially dating fossils, once living things, using carbon-14 dating.
There are some very specific instances where fossils can be carbon dated, but this is limited to fossils that are already known to be less than about 100,000 years old, and the fossil itself must be made of an organic material, such as wood. If a fossil has been fully permineralized, carbon dating will not be applicable because, to borrow a turn of phrase from Potholer 54, there's no fucking carbon in it! Well, sometimes there is, but there are known contamination factors, recrystallization, bacterial activity, and radiation from uranium decay causing the spontaneous formation of carbon-14 from nitrogen atoms, to name a few. Such factors would usually be negligible, but if we're talking about a sample that is too old to be carbon dated, that will cause detectable levels of carbon-14 to be present, which, just by its very presence, will result in an age calculation of about 100,000 years, and this is exactly why 100,000 years is the upper limit for carbon dating, and even then you can only use it in extraordinary circumstances, as our calibration curve for carbon dating only goes back to about 55,000 years.
Carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14, also referred to as radiocarbon, is claimed to be a reliable dating method for determining the age of fossils up to 50,000 to 60,000 years.
Yes, asterisk. There are a lot of factors that can impact the ages that are given by carbon dating, more so for carbon dating than for the other radiometric dating methods, which is why I suspect creationists like to pick on carbon dating. One of the hiccups with carbon dating is that the production of carbon-14 in the atmosphere is not a constant. It changes over time depending on several factors, probably the most important of which is the strength of the Earth's magnetic field. This is why the carbon calibration curve is necessary, and actually a new curve was just published in 2020, with the previous one having been published in 2013. As we gather more data, we can create a more accurate curve and thereby get more accurate dates when doing carbon dating. And of course there are other known issues like the marine reservoir effect and all the excess carbon that humans are pumping into the atmosphere with the burning of fossil fuels and the testing of nuclear bombs. But yes, carbon dating is reliable and accurate for the appropriate materials up to an age of about 55,000 years. 55,000 being the upper limit for the 2020 calibration curve, an improvement of 5,000 years over the 2013 curve. But wait, didn't I just say that you could get to 100,000 years? Yes, in extraordinary circumstances. One of the reasons that the circumstances have to be extraordinary is because we don't have a calibration curve that goes back that far. That is the hypothetical limit based on the half-life of carbon-14, with the 55,000 years being the effective limit based on our technology and the calibration curve.
If this claim is true, the biblical account of a young Earth, about 6,000 years, is in question, since carbon-14 dates of tens of thousands of years are common.
Yes. Even if we ignore all of the other radiometric dating methods, carbon dating does demonstrate that the Earth cannot be a mere 6,000 years old. And that's not just looking at the results returned by carbon dates, but the methods used to figure out the calibration curve as well. We have an unbroken dendrochronological record going back 13,910 years. So right there, the Earth is more than twice as old as the young Earth creationists want it to be. And then we also have data from ice cores, laminated lake and marine sediments, cave stalagmites, and corals. All of these data points get their dates independent of carbon dating, whether it be by visual stratigraphy, electrical conductivity dating, ESR dating, radiometric dating with other isotopes, what have you. And then, once the dates are determined with a non-carbon method, they date the sample using carbon and figure out what the offset is, thereby figuring out how much more or less carbon was in the atmosphere at that sample's formation than there is today. The most recent calibration curve is based on almost 13,000 individual data points, which is more than twice as many as there were for the 2013 curve.
When a scientist's interpretation of data does not match the clear meaning of the text in the Bible, we should never reinterpret the Bible.
AKA, if something is scientifically demonstrable but goes against my interpretation of the Bible, which for creationists is the interpretation which requires the least amount of thought, then there's no reason to rethink my overly simplistic interpretation of a book which all evidence points to not having been taken literally by the authors themselves. Rather, just find excuses as to why I can ignore the scientifically demonstrable thing.
God knows just what he meant to say, and his understanding of science is infallible, whereas ours is fallible.
Yeah, nobody is claiming that our understanding of science is perfect, but there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that is just flat out 100% scientifically wrong. The order of creation, for instance. In Genesis, God created the earth at the same time as the heavens, which is usually taken to mean the rest of the universe. He then created light, and then created the firmament, the solid dome separating the primordial universe waters from the waters of heaven. Then he gathered the primordial universe waters together into one place to allow the dry land of the earth to appear. Then he created plants, and then the sun, moon, and stars, then birds and fish, then other animals, then humans. So according to the chronology of Genesis, the earth existed before the sun, moon, and stars. There is a solid dome above it that keeps the waters of heaven out, unless God opens the windows of heaven to allow it to rain on the earth. Then God made the sun, moon, and stars after making the earth and everything, placed them all within the solid sky dome. Okay, you know what? Just ignore the order for a second and take a look at the sky dome. That is unscientific. It is so unscientific that not even creationists accept it, usually. So the scientific interpretation of the data does not match the clear meaning of the text in the Bible, and yet creationists have chosen to reinterpret the firmament to mean something else, something that the authors of Genesis clearly were not intending, instead reinterpreting it to mean either the atmosphere, a vapor or ice canopy, or all of outer space in Answers in Genesis' case, with the waters above referring to the, I guess, waters that exist at the outer boundary of the universe? That would be a hell of a lot of water, assuming that the universe even has an outer boundary as we would understand it, and that's a whole new can of worms that I don't even want to touch.
We should never think of it as necessary to modify his word.
Okay, so you'll not be reinterpreting the firmament to mean the edge of the universe or whatever then? Because that'd be a modification of the Bible's words, buddy.
Since the Bible is the inspired word of God, we should examine the validity of the standard interpretation of carbon-14 by asking several questions. 1. Is the explanation of the data derived from empirical observational science or an interpretation of past events, historical science?
That's a false dichotomy. All of science is basically a combination of the two, with certain branches leaning more toward one or the other. So, for instance, with dendrochronology, which is the field of science that we use to make up the first part of our carbon-14 calibration curve, we directly measured not only the decay rate and amounts of the various carbon isotopes in the wood, we also directly observed living trees to learn about their growth cycle to determine that they actually do produce one ring per year. We observe variations in the ring patterns that indicate double growth years or missing growth years, and we learn how to account for such factors when dating the tree rings with visual methods. So sure, we don't directly observe the trees being planted, but we calculate the tree's age based on direct observation. The same applies for dating the other samples that we use to build the calibration curve. Ice cores in particular are dated with sometimes dozens of independent dating methods.
2. Are there any assumptions involved in the dating method?
Yes. What assumptions they are depend on the dating method, but there are some basic assumptions. One is that the decay rate for the element has not changed. In non-isochron dating, the absence of daughter elements when the sample formed is also an assumption, and that the sample remained a closed system is, to a certain degree, also an assumption. Again, in non-isochron dating. But none of these are just pure assumptions in the sense that they have never been questioned. Quite the contrary, there is an active debate about the potential for so-called space weather to affect nuclear decay rates. If it turns out that it does have an effect, it is so small as to be pretty much negligible, at least when considering radiometric dating. We may have to adjust some dates here and there if they're right, but it won't get us down to 6,000 years by any stretch of the imagination. It's also worth mentioning that the paper that found the correlation between the variation in the measured decay rate and the space weather also found instances where there was no correlation with sometimes the exact same elements, and while they do speculate about potential reasons why, at best, this paper can be said to indicate that more research is needed. Also worth mentioning is that the reference list for this paper is 55 papers long, and they are split about half and half between researchers finding something that looks like a changing decay rate, and other researchers finding out why the apparent change in decay rates was not actually a change in the decay rate. The vast majority of the papers they reference are from the last 10 years, with fully half of them being the last 5 years. So, yeah. Remember, when a scientist says assumption, they do not mean what AIG is implying here, that it's just assumed to be true with zero evidence. Rather, it means something that is apparently true, but is impossible to verify with 100% certainty, and in this case there is active research going on to bring certainty as close to 100% as possible. Oh yeah, and also there are a few known scenarios in which the half-life can be affected, but the ones that are most likely to happen naturally can only affect it by a very, very small amount, typically significantly less than 1%. The ones that aren't likely to happen in nature require things like particle accelerators and nuclear reactors.
3. Are the dates provided by carbon-14 dating consistent with what we observe?
Yep.
4. Do all scientists accept the carbon-14 dating method as reliable and accurate?
The vast majority do when it's used properly.
The secular, evolutionary worldview interprets the universe and world to be billions of years old. The Bible teaches a young universe and Earth. Which worldview does science support?
The one with the old universe and Earth. Let's walk through a hypothetical. Rock A has been dated using uranium-lead dating and rubidium-strontium dating, both of which agree that it was formed 220 million years ago. Rock B was dated using these same two dating methods, both agree that it was formed 50 million years ago. The young Earth creation model would have that both were formed sometime during the flood, about 4,000 years ago, within 1 year of each other at most. In order for this to be true, the half-lives of uranium and rubidium would both have to be adjusted, but it's not that simple. If you adjust the half-life of uranium globally, then both samples would be measured to be the same age with the uranium-lead dating method. They don't. They came back with different ages with that method. So the half-life of uranium would have to have been adjusted differently in each rock independently. And because we have a second dating method, rubidium-strontium, that agrees with the uranium-lead dating method, that rules out contamination, so the half-life of rubidium would have to have been changed as well, but again, it would have to be changed by a different amount in each of our two rocks, and it would have to be changed in a very specific way to make a dating measurement that agrees with the uranium dating measurement. Now, expand this out to every single sample that has ever been radiometrically dated. For each one, the various half-lives would have to have been adjusted in a different manner than not only the half-lives of the other elements within the a sample, but also in a different manner than the same element in different samples. And this isn't even getting into the fact that radiation from nuclear decay is one of the reasons the mantle of the Earth is still molten today. Decay releases energy, which helps heat the core. If all the decay rates shifted drastically enough to allow us to measure billions of years worth of decay, but that decay actually happened in just 4,000 years, the entire Earth would have turned into a big molten ball of lava, one which would have taken another few million years to cool enough for a solid crust to exist. So the very fact that we can sit here on solid ground and not in a pool of lava is proof that the decay rates did not change drastically enough for young Earth creationism to be true.
Can carbon-14 dating help solve the mystery of which worldview is more accurate?
Yes. While carbon-14 wouldn't be the element keeping the Earth molten in the creationist scenario of wildly shifting decay rates, it is reliable enough to get us well past the 6,000-year age of the Earth that creationists favor.
The use of carbon-14 dating is often misunderstood. Carbon-14 is mostly used to date once-living things, organic material. It cannot be used to directly date rocks. However, it can potentially be used to put time constraints on some inorganic materials such as diamonds. Diamonds could contain carbon-14.
You are mostly correct here. Now, I know where you're going with the diamond thing. That comes around back at the end of the video, so I'm not going to deal with it here. But really, carbon dating could, hypothetically, show a diamond that is still thought to be old to, in fact, be young. I'm skipping past the next little bit. It gives a half-decent overview of how carbon dating works, though of course they don't mention anything about the reservoir effect, which creationists love to use to show carbon dates that are obviously wildly inaccurate. Basically, marine carbon reservoirs make marine samples look older than they are, if not calibrated with one of the marine calibration curves, relying on the atmospheric one instead.
Since the half-life of carbon-14 is known, how fast it decays, the only part left to determine is the starting amount of carbon-14 in a fossil. If the scientist knows the original amount of carbon-14 in a creature when it died, they can measure the current amount and then calculate how many half-lives have passed.
Correct. I'm skipping more now because this is where they just explain about the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, which at the moment is 1 carbon-14 atom for every trillion carbon-12 atoms. And this ratio is used to determine the starting amount of carbon-14 in a sample, and is adjusted based on the calibration curve.
A critical assumption used in carbon-14 dating has to do with this ratio. It is assumed that the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere has always been the same as it is today.
Is that an assumption, though? Why, then, do we have a calibration curve that is used to correct for various amounts of carbon-14 in the atmosphere at any given time? Does this chapter even so much as mention the calibration curve? Spoilers, no, it does not. Why not? Well, far be it from me to assume other people's motivations when they don't tell you themselves, but if I were to hazard a guess, I would say that it's because it renders this whole argument entirely and unequivocally invalid. I mean, you're attacking this assumption as though it were an unquestioned tenet of carbon dating, when it's not even an assumption in the first place. Remember how carbon dating is generally used on samples that are up to a maximum age of about 55,000 years? That's not because of the short half-life. If the short half-life were the limiting factor, it would be useful up to 100,000 years. Its shortened usefulness is because of the limitations of other areas of science that are able to determine the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere in the past, fields of study like dendrochronology. That's why the int cal 20, that is the calibration curve, is exciting to scientists. It pushes the usefulness of carbon dating back another 5,000 years over the int cal 13. But yeah, this oversight demonstrates rather conclusively that this very lengthy article about carbon dating was written by someone who is either entirely ignorant on the matter, or who is willfully omitting information that runs counter to their narrative. And lest you look at the publication date on this article on AIG's website, find that it is 2007, and then declare that I am being unfair for bringing up calibration curves that were published in 2013 and 2020, the first calibration curve for carbon dating was published in 1967, so there is no reason for this glaring omission, except for the fact that it goes against your narrative.
Dr. William Libby,
God damn it, past Rhino, it's Willard, not William, learn to read.
The founder of the carbon-14 dating method, assumed this ratio to be constant. His reasoning was based on a belief in evolution, which assumes the Earth must be billions of years old. Assumptions in the scientific community are extremely important. If the starting assumption is false, all the calculations based on that assumption might be correct, but still give a wrong conclusion.
Nope. His reasoning was based on the fact that they didn't have a way of calibrating for changing carbon levels at the time, and he knew damn well that it would have to be accounted for. He never liked that assumption, but as the dating method was still a work in progress, it was acceptable to make that assumption as long as you were clear about the fact that it hasn't been corrected for. Even so, the dates worked pretty well, if not perfectly, for artifacts of known ages. The fact that they weren't perfect on the first try is in no way damning to the modern science of carbon dating. I'm skipping the rest of the Dr. Libby stuff. At best, if AIG is right about what he said, then he was wrong. But I wouldn't bet on AIG being right about it. I just have one more point to make about the end of the Libby stuff, so that's where I'm skipping.
However, the discrepancy had turned out to be very real. The ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 is not constant. The specific production rate, SPR, of carbon-14 is known to be 18.8 atoms per gram of total carbon per minute. The specific decay rate, SDR, is known to be only 16.1 disintegrations per gram per minute. What does this mean? If it takes about 30,000 years to reach equilibrium and carbon-14 is still out of equilibrium, then maybe the Earth is not very old.
I find this to be rather amusing. They point out that the ratio of C14 to C12 is not constant, point out the current specific production and specific decay rates of C14, and then immediately start treating these numbers as constants to conclude that the Earth can't be more than 30,000 years old. Pick a lane, guys. The answer's right there in the first sentence. They are not constants.
Magnetic field of the Earth. Other factors can affect the production rate of carbon-14 in the atmosphere.
Yep, they sure can.
The Earth has a magnetic field around it which helps protect us from harmful radiation from outer space. This magnetic field is decaying, getting weaker.
Currently, yes, it is decaying. The Earth's magnetic field has lost 10 to 15% of its strength over the last 150 years. Now, this article doesn't go into it, but I know that AIG is of the opinion that the decline in the magnetic field strength is an argument for a young Earth. At the rate it's declining, it's not possible for it to be millions of years old. Of course, this is based on a gross assumption, and not the kind of assumption that I was talking about earlier that is constantly being tested to the best of our ability, but rather an assumption that we know for a fact from observation to be wrong. The magnetic field does not decay at a constant rate. In fact, we know that in the late 8th century BCE, the magnetic field went through a sudden spike, being about double what it is today, and possibly even stronger than it has ever been in its entire history. But it then lost 30% of its intensity over a 30-year period. We know this from the ancient practice of paying taxes in commodities like olive oil in jars whose handles were stamped with the royal seal. The stamps in the handles provide tight time constraints on when the jar could have been made, and tiny flecks of iron in the clay align with the Earth's magnetic field during the firing process and then freeze into position when the pottery cools. I am skipping the rest of this section, as all they say is that the strength of the magnetic field affects the rate of carbon-14 production in the atmosphere, which is entirely true and entirely accounted for in the calibration curve.
Genesis flood. What role might the Genesis flood have played in the amount of carbon? The flood would have buried large amounts of carbon from living organisms, plant and animal, to form today's fossil fuels, coal, oil, etc. The amount of fossil fuels indicates that there must have been a vastly larger quantity of vegetation in existence prior to the flood than exists today.
Yes, actually, that's true. If there was a global flood 4,000 years ago and all the sedimentary layers of rock were formed in that flood, then there would have had to have been so much plant material on the Earth at one time that the amount of light coming to us from the sun would not have been physically able to sustain it all simultaneously.
The Rate Group obtained these 10 coal samples from the U.S. Department of Energy Coal Sample Bank from samples collected from major coal fields across the United States. The chosen coal samples, which dated millions to hundreds of millions of years old based on standard evolution time estimates, all contained measurable amounts of carbon-14.
Yes, there are a number of reasons for this, the most prominent of which is the fact that the processing procedures for measuring carbon-14 in a sample will always, 100% of the time, introduce modern carbon contamination into the sample. This is normally accounted for in the calculations, but the Rate Group decided not to account for this known contamination factor for whatever reason.
In all cases, careful precautions were taken to eliminate any possibility of contamination from other sources.
No matter how careful your process is to avoid contamination, the best equipped laboratories in the world at the time the Rate Project was doing their work would introduce a minimum of 1 microgram of modern carbon into a sample during processing for measurement in an accelerator mass spectrometer, and the AMS will introduce more carbon still.
The average carbon-14 estimated age for all layers from these three time periods were approximately 50,000 years. However, using a more realistic pre-flood carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio reduces that age to about 5,000 years.
To translate out of creationist ease, the layers that are known to be millions of years old were dated with a method that is known to not be accurate on samples older than about 50,000 years. They then got back an age of about 50,000 years, ignored the calibration curve that is based on actual data in favor of just assuming a 500-fold increase in carbon levels 4,000 years ago, bringing the adjusted age down to 5,000 years, nicely within the 6,000-year time frame that you decided in advance must be accurate. This stinks of post hoc rationalization rather than following the data where it actually leads, especially since the measured age was right on the edge of what it was possible to measure at the time.
These results indicate that the entire geologic column is less than 100,000 years old, and could be much younger. This confirms the Bible and challenges the evolutionary idea of long geologic ages. Because the lifetime of carbon-14 is so brief, these AMS measurements pose an obvious challenge to the standard geologic timescale that assigns millions to hundreds of millions of years to this part of the rock layer. Another noteworthy observation from the rate group was the amount of carbon-14 found in diamonds.
Yep, there sure has been carbon-14 found in diamonds. There are a few factors here. For one, background radiation will produce small quantities of carbon-14 where nitrogen exists, and as diamonds are made entirely out of carbon, nitrogen impurities are inevitable as the carbon-14 contained in the diamond decays. Yes, the carbon-14 should be completely gone by now, but every now and again, one of the leftover nitrogen atoms gets converted back into carbon through nuclear interactions with background radiation. Secondly, the rate team measured carbon levels in both processed and unprocessed diamonds. The processed diamonds had C14 levels that were only slightly higher than background levels, and the unprocessed ones measured significantly less carbon than the processed ones, well within the expected background range. And that's basically it for this one. They give a brief summary, but there's nothing new there. So we find here that this is one of AIG's more obviously wrong articles. With a simple search, these answers are readily available, and most are fairly easy to understand. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Ken Christensen, who says, "Scientists and zoologists do not claim that modern birds are dinosaurs. No one says a flock of sparrows are really a group of dinosaurs. Why do you have to deny evolution, Rhino? Only atheists who are jealous of the word kind need to claim that modern birds are dinosaurs." Well, Ken, to quote Kevin Padian, the professor of integrative biology at UC Berkeley, who wrote his PhD dissertation on a detailed phylogeny of diapsids, from his 2007 paper on the origin and evolution of birds published in the Cambridge Philosophical Society journal Biological Reviews, birds evolved from and are phylogenetically recognized as members of the theropod dinosaurs. I think if anyone is going to be familiar with the scientific consensus on the matter, it'll be a guy who got his PhD discussing that very matter. And yes, nobody says a flock of dinosaurs, just as nobody complains about being bitten by a diptera when a mosquito bites them, despite mosquitoes being part of the diptera clade. Not sure why you think anyone would be jealous of the word kind. It's not even properly defined, so how can we even know enough about what it is to be jealous? Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the magnetic field that affects the carbon production of my channel. If you'd like to fluctuate wildly over time, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!